Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar. I want to welcome everyone who's joining today through Zoom, as well as through the EarthX Vimeo live stream. Today's session is Mobilizing Employees for Climate Action. Just a moment on the organization that I work for, Future 500. We are a nonprofit that builds trust between companies, investors, advocates, and philanthropists, and business as a force for good. And as many of you know, this is the fifth in a series of virtual events that we are hosting in partnership with EarthX throughout April. With that, let's kick off today's discussion. It's my privilege to introduce Bill Weihl, former green energy czar at Google and former director of sustainability at Facebook. He's now off on a completely new and different endeavor that should be on the radar for every company, as well as everyone else in the virtual room today. Bill, I'd like to invite you to turn on your video, take yourself off mute. The floor is yours to take us into today.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks, folks, for joining. Happy Earth Day. And Andrea, if we could move to the next slide. I want to start by acknowledging that these are difficult times. I'm still not seeing the next slide. Hold on once, there we go. This was me at 3 a.m. 15 years ago, thinking about climate. This is why I made a big career shift from starting in computer science to moving to working on climate and energy and sustainability. I think it's probably now many of us thinking about the pandemic, worrying about the pandemic, and if you're here today, probably worrying about climate a bit too. If we can move to the next slide. So this is a time of crisis, an immediate crisis that is affecting everyone. In a time of crisis like this, I think it's important to see hope and a path ahead. And today I'm going to talk about a strategy we can all be part of while we're flattening the coronavirus curve, to flatten the climate curve as well, because there are remarkable parallels between this immediate crisis and the somewhat longer term, but not as long term as we used to think it was, climate crisis. Next slide, please. We started ClimateVoice. It's a new organization. We started it 2 months ago, literally 2 months ago today. And some people said, great timing. It could have been worse. It could have been a few weeks later. Already we're seeing evidence of impact. This is in many ways a dark time. There are lots of communities and families and companies that are struggling. And I want to try to focus on, I want to acknowledge that, but focus on how we can create a path to a sustainable, livable, healthy future for everyone. I've led on this issue inside the corporate sector. As Brendan mentioned, I led climate and clean energy work at Google and then broader sustainability work at Facebook. I've seen the change that can happen, both in companies and in their impact on the world. Change at companies can go fast or slow. Today, I would argue, given where we are on climate, we need to make it go much faster, both globally, but also in terms of what companies are doing. It's really vital for us to make the rapid progress we need to make on climate. Next slide, please. Let me spend a couple minutes talking about what we need to do to address the climate emergency. And I'm using the term emergency as opposed to just climate change or global warming, because I think this is an emergency. Much like the pandemic, people were talking about pandemics 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and about how they are inevitable and we need to prepare. People have been talking about climate for a long time, 40, 50 years or more, and the science is getting clearer. It's clear that we are on a path toward potentially catastrophic impacts. We need to do more to prepare. We hear a lot in terms of what we need to do about moonshots, breakthroughs, investment, behavior change, voluntary action. I was really lucky to be able to spend almost 13 years at Google and then Facebook working on all of those. And we need more of them. We're not going to get to net zero emissions by 2050 without some serious breakthroughs. We're not going to get to that target without massive investment. So all of those things are needed. But the IPCC says we need to cut emissions not just to zero or net zero by 2050, but essentially in half in the next decade. That's what's in their 1.5 degree report from a year and a half ago. That's not really about moonshots. What we're going to do between now and 2030 to cut emissions that much is not about some magic breakthrough that might appear in 2 years or 5 years. It's not about, or not just about, behavior change or voluntary action. It's about moving a lot of capital and deploying the heck out of solar, wind, storage, EVs, heat pumps, other solutions we have in hand today. Some of them, people, 10 or 15 years ago would have said, those are miracles, those are moonshots, like getting solar and wind cheaper than coal. We've done that collectively. And companies are doing a lot. They're investing, they're moving capital, they're taking voluntary actions, they're deploying climate solutions, and yet emissions are still rising. So what more do we need? That's the question I want to talk about, and how do we get there? I like to think of this as the improv approach to climate, not that you ever want to see me actually doing improv, but it's about yes and. So yes, we need innovation. Yes, and we need finance. Yes, and we need behavior change. Yes, and we need voluntary action. And to underpin and turbocharge all of that, to make it happen at the speed required by the urgency of the climate crisis. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have said next slide. So there's the yes and. If you could move to the next slide, my apologies. To really make all of that happen at the speed that we need policy. And what I mean by that is public policy, not just internal company policies about their operations or their supply chain, but smart public policies like a price on carbon, like clean energy mandates, like building codes, and many others that reduce risk, that drive innovation, that drive investment, that drive deployment, that give us some certainty that we will actually get on and stay on the decarbonization pathway that science says we need to be on, So most Americans agree, and this is certainly true around the world, but even in the US, where public opinion has been somewhat fractured on the climate issue, and where the politics have been particularly fractured, most Americans agree that we need to act faster. The polls are quite clear. They agree that government should do more. And young people especially agree with those statements. And most of us might think, if you ever took a course on civics or have some vague idea of how government and society should work, you might think that policy should reflect our collective will, but it clearly isn't. So next slide, please. So why aren't we seeing fast enough progress on climate policy? And here I think it's important to be honest about what's really been happening on this front for the last decade, and honestly several decades. The dominant business voice on climate policy for a long time has counseled denial, and then in the last number of years, caution and delay. And some of you in the audience probably work for companies that have been part of that. And in many cases, the companies are motivated maybe by an honest belief the problem isn't so bad, and certainly by a desire to protect their own business. But today, we are at a crisis point and a turning point on climate where it's time for that to end. And what we are tapping into with ClimateVoice and what we are helping accelerate is a trend where your workers, your current and especially your future workers, are going to demand that that ends. The companies that have been pushing denial and delay need to get on board with rapid decarbonization and need to support real plans to do it, not just plans that might accomplish what we need, but have a very high chance of not, and protect their business, but plans that may involve them shifting their businesses in significant ways, but protect human society as a whole. And those that have been on the sidelines and really complicit in perpetuating business as usual by letting the fossil fuel companies and others dominate the policy conversation, they need to get off the sidelines and be much better allies in the fight to prevent climate change or prevent the worst impacts. So if you could go to the next slide. Some companies are going to do this because it's the right thing to do. Most, I think, need to be convinced. That's certainly been my experience in the business world, that even when companies believe something is the right thing to do, they might not, because they see risk for themselves in speaking up, whether it might jeopardize revenue from some of their customers, or it might annoy or offend a policymaker who has the power to hurt them in their operations through some regulatory changes. We are mobilizing the workforce, current and future employees, to convince companies that now is the time to speak up, to go all in on climate in their operations, in how their products are used, in their advocacy, and in other ways. And we've been inspired by the LGBT rights movement and how employees and students sent a very clear signal to companies that it was time for them to speak up. Companies had been acting on LGBT rights. They were offering equal benefits to employees in domestic partnerships, having policies that outlawed discrimination in hiring or who they serve. And starting around a decade ago, they really started to speak up on marriage equality at the state and federal level, on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana, the bathroom bill in North Carolina, many other state and in some cases federal policies in the US. They went from being bystanders, saying essentially, we don't discriminate, to being what the anti-bullying world would call upstanders. We advocate strongly for equality and against discrimination everywhere. We are active participants in solving this problem broadly, not just being good actors ourselves. And most of them did it because their employees spoke up. And it was clear that college students thought it was a no-brainer. And they were worried that if they stayed on the sidelines, they would be painted as complicit, and that would make it hard for them to retain employees and to hire new employees. And that was a risk they didn't want to take. So next slide, please. In this environment, this is a tough environment for companies. Lots of companies are looking for lifelines from the federal government and otherwise, and they need them. And some companies will just go after their narrow self-interest. And I hope that not many, but others have increasingly been seen protecting the future of the planet. And especially, it's not just about the planet, because the planet, to be honest, it'll be fine. It's going to change, but it has survived many changes before. But our ability to live on it and thrive on it, companies are seeing that as part of their corporate mission, and that their responsibility is not just their operations and their products, but the broader society that they're part of. So let me give you a concrete and very recent example. Just over a week ago, the Virginia Clean Economy Act was signed into law. This bill mandates 100% zero carbon electricity in the Commonwealth of Virginia by mid-century. In fact, by 2045 for much of the state, the part served by Dominion. It got support from companies in the clean energy sector and from the major utilities. It also got support from many companies not in the energy sector. So companies for whom this bill was not directly relevant to their operations. And some of them are listed here. It's part of a state level trend to move aggressively toward meeting carbon reduction goals. And it's part of a trend of companies beginning to speak up much more broadly on climate policy. And for us at ClimateVoice, it was our first policy victory. We launched with campaigns 2 months ago on 3 policies: this bill in Virginia, a clean energy bill in Illinois, and a transportation initiative on the East Coast. We need to see action on those 3. We've gotten the Virginia bill over the line, but we need to see action on those others and on many other policies across the country and in Washington, D.C. if we're going to have a hope of really addressing the climate emergency. So next slide, please. At ClimateVoice, we're raising the bar for companies. Leadership on climate in the last decade has meant decarbonizing your own operations and maybe making some progress on your supply chain and supporting the Paris Agreement, but not much else. And for the next decade, we really need companies to go all in on climate. Every decision a company makes should be evaluated in terms of its impact on the company's profit and loss, its bottom line, and also based on its impact on climate. So if you're buying energy, is that clean or dirty? If you're building a building, is it efficient or not? If you're sourcing products from a supplier, what are they doing about their own emissions? If you're selling your products to someone, what are they doing with it? Is that going to increase emissions or decrease emissions? And if you're speaking up or choosing to be silent, what's the impact of that on policy? If there's an important climate policy being debated and some companies whose businesses might be directly affected by it are lobbying hard against it. Are you silent and on the sidelines and allowing them to be the dominant voice, or are you speaking up in favor of the climate action that society needs? And that's true with direct lobbying, it's true with political contributions, membership in trade associations, and other ways. Basically, whatever a company is doing, they should be asking, is this consistent with a 1.5 degree future where warming is held to tolerable levels? Or is it enabling or complicit with the business as usual path we're on, which is heading us toward 3 or 4 or more degrees of warming, which could be absolutely catastrophic. And it's important to understand this is not just about individual action by companies. Most of the focus of the last decade in terms of leadership has been on what companies can do themselves or what people could do with the company's products. This is about all the things that are needed to drive the rapid systemic change that we need to get us on a safe decarbonization pathway. And that means companies need to get off the sidelines in this chess game. And it is a chess game or worse, and help counter the powerful forces that are dragging us in the wrong direction. That's especially true and relevant today as we debate how to spend trillions of dollars of public money. We've already spent over $2 trillion, or authorized, it hasn't all been spent, but much of it has. We will probably spend trillions more in several more rounds of stimulus and ultimately, hopefully, recovery packages. Are we going to spend that money basically to rebuild the economy as it's been and lock in infrastructure and other things that will keep us on this business as usual path where emissions rise or maybe are flat or maybe decline very slowly? Or will we spend it on things that give us reasonable confidence that we will be on a path to decarbonize at the rate the science says we need to do? Companies need to not just advocate for their piece of this extremely large pie, but for policies that ensure that we build back better, not just rebuild what we have, but build better, build forward to build the infrastructure and the foundation for the 21st century clean economy that we need. That means we build sustainability, mass transit, clean energy, clean buildings, regenerative agriculture, et cetera, into these massive public investments we're making in our economic future. Next slide, please. So at ClimateVoice, we're mobilizing students and employees to let companies know that it's time for them to go all in on climate. In their operations, their investments, their supply chain, the use of their products, and perhaps most important, but certainly not the only thing, in public policy. We're raising the bar and we're watching, along with current and future employees, to see which companies step up. Next slide, please. So if you're an employee, current or future, my call to action for you is to go to climatevoice.org and sign our pledge and sign the petitions that we have that are currently active. And as we introduce more campaigns and more petitions, join those. Join your voice with others to convince companies to rise to the challenge of this moment, which has been magnified by the pandemic, and really go all in on climate. And share the pledge with your friends, your family, your colleagues. Help build a movement that will change the game on climate. And if you're an executive of a company or a trade association, my message for you is that the bar is going up. That what has been leadership, and you know, I've been part of that, and all of us are grateful for the leadership that companies have shown. We now need more. And young people especially are going to demand that. So companies need to step up. They need to get on the right side of history and help us all avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Those who do will find it easier to hire and retain workers, maybe not this week when you might not be hiring and you might, some of you will be laying people off, but in 6 or 12 or 18 months when you're hiring again and your current employees have other options and the young people coming out of college or high school or whatever also have other options. Those who step up now and continue to step up will have a big advantage. So let me just end by saying I hope all of you and your families are well and safe, and I'm sure some of you that's not true, and my heart goes out to you. We will get through this pandemic, and we will together get through the climate crisis. Thank you.
But Bill, I want to start off a bit on strategy. You touched on touched on the need to mobilize employees, some of the outcomes you want to see, but how are you going to be mobilizing employees? What will the evolving strategy look like in the coming years?
Well, there's strategy and there's tactics, and I will say our tactics changed dramatically starting about 5 weeks ago. We launched 9 weeks ago, and then the world started to shut down. So we are beginning to do more online events. We are engaging people through events where we can explain, not just in a tweet, but in 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, the importance of policy and the role that companies play. And we're doing this on college campuses virtually now. We're doing it with employees. I did an event with some Harvard students yesterday. We've got events with Google employees coming up soon. We've got events with people at other companies coming up soon. And then we're using social media and everything else you would use to spread the word and try to recruit more people. We are also, as an organization, using our voice, our megaphone, to highlight the companies that are stepping up and that are going all in or going more in, certainly. And starting in a few months, we will be highlighting and naming the companies, in fact, that are continuing to sit on the sidelines and that are lagging, to make sure that college students and employees know who's doing better and who's doing worse. We're working on scorecards that'll make that easier for people to say, so, you know, I'm looking at these 6 companies. How are they doing? We don't have those really yet. There is a group in the UK that we're working with called Influence Map that is actually producing a scorecard. It doesn't cover much in terms of US policy yet. And it only covers, I think, 100 or maybe 200 of the biggest companies around the world. We're working with them to expand that coverage to more companies and to be more granular about the policies that they cover. But it's a pretty good place to start if you want to know how are companies doing in using their influence, either to help advance climate solutions and drive the systemic change we need, or to delay action.
Great, that's helpful. Another question, Bill. You know, we've seen most examples of employee activism in the tech sector, and the perception and perhaps the reality is that, you know, tech employees are in high demand, and therefore they have leverage for their employers that employees in other sectors may not have, especially as we're going into a potential recession and depression. Employee leverage may be decreasing in the coming years. How do you see that factoring into your plans and activism?
So I think that the greatest leverage comes where there's the greatest demand, and that certainly tech has been a sector that has been growing quickly for a number of years. And so I think that's where there has been the greatest leverage for employees. But there are many other sectors that have been doing well in the last number of years. Right now, lots of sectors are hurting, no question. And I think that means in the immediate sort of near term, employees have less direct leverage. That said, you know, it is an issue of leverage. And so the more people who band together, the more leverage. There is risk in that. Amazon just fired 2 employees who've been very active both on the climate issues and on working conditions in their warehouses and distribution centers. And that is a concern that many people have, especially when the labor market is you know, getting very soft the way it is now. One of the things that we've thought very hard about that, and we want to ensure that people only take risks that they're comfortable with. So we allow people to sign our pledge and sign our petitions, but ask us to keep them anonymous. So we do not disclose their name, which means we can go to a company and say, we've had 500 of your employees sign this petition asking you to speak up on this particular policy. Or we've had 20,000 you know, college students and there are 5,000 software engineering undergraduates at these universities and so on. Well, I can tell you their names, but there are lots of people who you want to hire who care about this. And so we think that can influence companies. As I said, you know, right now when companies aren't hiring and might actually be laying people off, there's obviously much less leverage. And we're not suggesting that people should say, oh, that company's they're not perfect, they're not good enough on climate. I won't take a job there. If that's the only job you've got, you should take it, you should keep it. But if you have options, we want you to then think about your career and which companies you work for as an investment. People spend 80 to 90,000 hours of their lives at work, which is, I had not done the math until maybe a year ago when someone kind of quoted that statistic. Like, really, that can't be right. That's for most people the biggest investment they will make in their entire lives. And if you care about climate, and I think young people increasingly say this is an existential issue, this is my future, this is the future of human society, then you should be making that investment in a way that is as aligned as possible with creating the future and driving us all toward that future. So companies, as I said, that maybe aren't hiring now, but know that in a year or two or three, as we recover from this recession, they will be hiring. They do not want to be looked on college campuses as having sat on the sidelines and been on the wrong side of this issue and only been in it for themselves. Mm-hmm. Companies have been talking a lot in the last year or two or three, and Larry Fink at BlackRock and the Business Roundtable talking about stakeholder capitalism, and companies having a responsibility and a need to bring value not just to their shareholders but to a broader range of stakeholders. Climate is one of the ultimate collective action issues. Pandemic is another. And companies that get in there and just try to grab what they need and don't pay attention to what we collectively need to build and the path we collectively need to get on, I think will not be looked upon favorably in a year or two or three. So if you don't want to poison the well on college campuses for the hiring you will be doing in a year or two or three, now is not the time to focus on just on your own narrow self-interest.
Yeah. Bill, I hear a lot of yes and, within your response and your advice to employees. And so that's definitely the thinking that I know you're trying to inspire. We have a question here that I find fascinating. Talent at big firms are often shareholders in their employers through retirement benefits. Is there an avenue to organize shareholder advocacy with employees into what you see with As You Sow or a Trillion Asset Management?
Absolutely. Many companies, maybe most, and many nonprofits have retirement plans. I know one of the things that As You Sow has talked about is the fact that most retirement plans don't offer even the option of investing your retirement dollars, your 401k contributions, and so on in ESG screened funds, fossil-free funds, et cetera. They might allow people to do it through, choose the brokerage option and then go, you manage the money and you can invest in whatever you want. That's much more work. Almost no one does that. So there is a growing push to get companies to actually open up their 401ks to offer ESG screened options. And I think a lot of people will choose those if they can. And I think there is an opportunity for investors to educate employees about the pressure and the encouragement they can put on their employers. There's also an opportunity for investors through shareholder resolutions in other ways. And there's an opportunity for investors to press employers, press the companies they invest in, not just to reduce their own carbon footprint, but to actually step up in being advocates for the collective action we need to take and the policies that we need to take. And mostly we have not seen investors pushing companies to speak up on policy yet. That's where I'm saying, the bar for leadership has been here. It now needs to go here. Employees need to help raise that bar. Investors need to help raise that bar. Customers need to help raise that bar.
Well, the questions are coming in hot and fast, and we're going to use the next 25 minutes to go through them. But Bill, an anonymous question here. Many of your former colleagues and peers at other companies might now perceive you as a frenemy. What has that dynamic been like? And as you now look to engage them from the quote unquote other side, have they been receptive, combative, dismissive?
The answer is probably yes, and it seems to be the answer to many things. So yes, I'm still a friend. I think business has a vital role to play in solving these problems. I think that business also has to play a role in helping drive the collective action that we need. So it is yes and. Yes, all the things you've been doing have been great, and do more of them. And if we're going to solve this problem collectively, we need things where when you sit on the sidelines, or you don't offer sustainable options in your 401k, or you actively sell your products in ways that increase emissions, those are things that are not consistent with the future that we all need to have. And so it's not enough to do some good. You have to actively help combat the bad. And many businesses are not doing that yet. They've been focused on their operations. Now it's time to focus more broadly. And every decision they make, they need to be asking not just, is it good for my bottom line, but what's the impact on climate? And sometimes those will be in conflict. And then they've got a hard choice to make. And I know, I've been there, I know how hard those choices are. I think what I have heard privately from many of my peers and colleagues who are in positions that, like the ones that I've been in for the last 15 years, is that it's going to be hard for their companies to get more pressure to raise the bar, but that if there isn't outside pressure, they won't step up, or certainly won't step up very quickly, because they see all these conflicts and all these risks. And without something to counterbalance those, the natural thing, the rational thing, if they just think about themselves, is to stay on the sidelines, not to forego $100 million of revenue by saying we won't sell that product and have it be used that way. That's just something that's very hard for a company to do unless there's significant pressure pushing in the other direction. So what I've heard from many people privately is they are grateful for this pressure. They think they need it, and they think their companies will be grateful in the end, even if, publicly they might resist for a while.
It can be both at once. Well, we have another question coming in, and this is from Bob Stout, the head of U.S. policy at BP. And Bill, you might have seen him on one of our webinars a couple weeks ago.
Indeed.
Bob says, Bill, excellent presentation and love the Virginia example. How can companies work with you, motivate, and I'm assuming this is motivate other companies, join coalitions of other progressive companies to support specific policies? E.g., we at BP are advocating with other companies and NGOs for the Transportation and Climate Initiative in the Northeast, Reggie in Virginia and Pennsylvania. Would be great to have other companies join us.
So we are focusing on engaging, educating, and empowering students and employees. So we are talking with companies, we are engaging with them, we're trying to make clear to them what's happening with their workforce, current and future. If companies want to engage in policy, there are organizations like CERES, like AEE, the Advanced Energy Economy, and others. Their bread and butter is working with companies to organize them to lobby together and to advocate together. And so I would encourage companies to do that. I would encourage companies like BP, and we appreciate the leadership they've shown in some areas. I would encourage them to step up much more broadly, and I would encourage them to speak up more and encourage their peers in their sector and in other sectors to speak up, because part of companies follow each other. When companies see leading companies stepping up, they are more inclined to do it. So being much more vocal about that, I think, will pull more in. It also creates a public narrative where the companies that are on the sidelines then look like laggards, and no one wants to look like a laggard. So I think that would be my recommendation. TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, is one of the 3 initiatives we focused on at our launch and are still focused on, and we appreciate BP's support of that. It is one policy that will begin to reduce transportation emissions on the East Coast. It is far from the only policy needed. And so we need many more policies. We need support for much higher fuel efficiency in internal combustion powered vehicles. We need support for zero emissions vehicles, be they electric or hydrogen or potentially something else. This is not, there's no silver bullet for climate. There's no one solution. We need a bunch of them. And we need companies that care about climate to support not just the ones that are directly relevant to their business, but a range of policies, because otherwise we don't have a big enough coalition to actually drive most of them through.
Right. And Bob, I'll leave it to you to follow with Bill here at your
and I'd love, Bob,
convenience.
I'd love to talk offline separately. That would be great.
We have a question here, Bill, from Dean Barone about small businesses with less than 100 employees, which provide about 50% of the U.S. workforce. Question is, how can we help them rethink their business plans even while they are hurting the most right now? How do we show small businesses the opportunities to remake their businesses better?
Some of that's hard. There are a lot of things. This is part of why we need policy and a focus, more of a focus on systemic solutions. Because if you're a small business, there are many ways in which your business might impact the climate and other things where you can't make choices easily yourself to change them. And so part of it is getting involved in ways to support policy at every level of government. That means, and if you're a small business, you've got 100 employees or 50 employees, and maybe you're located in one place, look at what's happening in your city, in your county, in your state, and start to provide your support for the kinds of policies. There are lots of cities that have committed to 100% clean energy. There are cities that are now beginning to mandate that new construction be all electric to eliminate fossil fuel use in buildings. And we have the technology now where that actually is feasible, economical, better indoor air quality. When I started seeing the studies about the impact of using a gas stove on indoor air quality, I was a little bit horrified and not terrified, but concerned. There are many ways in which converting buildings or moving to all electric buildings benefits both the people in them and society more broadly. That's something we almost certainly need to start doing. Otherwise, we're going to be locking in infrastructure that if we don't have things like direct air capture at scale within, say, 5 years, we're going to be locking in infrastructure that guarantees we'll blow our carbon budget. So small businesses can start looking locally and then gradually more broadly. If you're a small business, it's hard for you to have direct impact at the national level in terms of influence because you're small. But there are lots of trade associations, small business associations. There's the American Sustainable Business Council, which is a large group of mostly small and medium-sized businesses that advocates at the state and federal level around the country for sustainable solutions, and not just around sustainability, but things that businesses need to survive. Especially, they're very active right now in things that small businesses need and that employees need to get through this pandemic. So I think, there's power and safety in numbers. Join some of those groups and lend your voice to them.
That's great. I know ASBC is a great resource, and Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL, and their Business Climate Leaders team also have a lot of on-the-ground resources across the country. Bill, you talked about your reception in the corporate world and with your former peers. How about on the flip side? How do you see coordination with campaigners, say like a Greenpeace? Does that help you? Does that set you back with that ClimateVoice is in cahoots with a Greenpeace-like organization? What has been the conversation there?
We are in conversation with most of the nonprofits and organizations that are working in the climate space, from the ones that work closely with companies, because if they are, if AEE or Ceres is working on getting the bill in Virginia across the line, and they're trying to recruit companies to speak up and join them in supporting it, it makes sense for us to help with that, not to go off and say, well, here's this bill in Iowa that nobody's really paying attention to, but we'll go focus on that. So, I've been a cyclist much of my life. I'd rather cycle with a tailwind than a headwind or no wind. And so we want to join forces and get more wood behind fewer arrows and actually help drive progress. So we are talking with the folks who work with companies. We are talking with the folks who, like Greenpeace, that tend to go after companies. We're in some ways somewhere in the middle. We are particularly focused on trying to get the companies that have been allies in the fight against climate change, to be better allies. That it's time for them to, much like what happened with LGBT rights, it's time for them to take a much broader approach to how they think about this, not just focus on their operations, but think about everything they do. And so, the companies who've been really in the denial and delay and sort of let's be very cautious mode, if they want to step up and become real allies, that's great. And I think we've seen progress from BP and Shell in the last number of months. That's great. We would like to see them, it's yes, and we'd like to see them do more. But they're not alone in that. We'd like to see everybody, almost everybody, do more. So anyway, so I think that's where that is.
Yeah, we're getting a sort of a broader question. What do you think the future of corporate sustainability will look like in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic? And how can employees continue to support and advocate for more sustainability actions from their corporations in our new normal?
I fell into sustainability, corporate sustainability, almost by accident. I decided to focus my career on climate, and I was really lucky to land a job at Google in early 2006. And the focus was climate. It broadened some over time. At Facebook, it was a sustainability job, but the big issue was climate and energy. And one of the things I've observed about corporate sustainability is that the focus tends to be on the company and on individual action by the company. And if there's one thing I think that this pandemic has shown us, it's that just focusing on individual action is not enough. There are things that we need to do collectively, and I'm sure that different people have different ideas about how broad that list is of things that we should do collectively or that we need to coordinate and plan on. But the lack of adequate planning, not just in the last 3 years, but really for far longer, the lack of adequate planning around the pandemic and the inadequate public health infrastructure has put us in a much worse state than we might have been in. The pandemic, the disease was going to happen almost certainly, right? We've known, and the public health experts, Larry Brilliant, who I was lucky enough to get to know and work with at Google and count as a friend, has been an expert on pandemics and diseases for decades. And he's been talking about the likelihood of a global pandemic now for a long time. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. Yeah. The question then is, when it happens, are we prepared to deal with it, and how do we deal with it? And I think we clearly were not adequately prepared. The same is true for climate. And preparing for it, avoiding the catastrophic impacts, and preparing to be resilient and to adapt to the things that do happen is something that we all can contribute to individually, but it is also something that we need to take collective action on. And that's about government. And I think corporate sustainability needs to broaden from just what this company can do to how it plays a role in that broader civic conversation in ensuring that we are taking the preparatory steps we need to take. So that is, I think, a shift that will happen in corporate sustainability. It needs to happen, that we broaden the focus from a company's individual responsibility for its own actions to what society needs to do and the role the company plays in making sure that the society takes the steps it needs to take, or the role it plays in allowing those who would rather not see that happen to carry the day and make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah, great. Bill, we have two questions coming in that are related. They're about tactics and scorecards specifically. The first comes from Mike Mielke with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Can you tell us about the scorecards that ClimateVoice will be using, the factors that will be considered, how they'll be rating companies, what demonstrates leadership? And then an anonymous question, the flip side, which industries do you believe will be more receptive? We'll put scorecards out for first. In which industries do you think scorecards can spur the most change? What are the factors, and will they make change?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is we are still figuring some of that out. But I think that I am a fan of relatively narrowly focused scorecards, because if you believe that there's an important thing that you need everybody to do, like we really need companies to step up on policy, then embedding that as one small factor in a broad scorecard about sustainability is unlikely to drive much change. So broad ESG scoring that various investment analysts do and so on, I think it would be great for them to incorporate corporate engagement on climate policy in that, but it's going to be a small factor among many. So we intend to build a scorecard that, as Influence Map has been doing, that highlights how companies are engaging on climate policy. And we're still working on the details. I think we will pick a good number, 50 or 100 climate policies around the country over the last number of years, and look at what companies have done. And then we will do that going forward, picking not every policy that's relevant to climate, because that's just too many, but many. And then ask for the companies that operate in the jurisdiction where that policy is being debated, which ones were on the right side and which ones weren't. And being silent, from our point of view, is essentially as bad as being actively on the wrong side, because that's enabling the voices on the wrong side to dominate the conversation and win. So we want people to be strong, proactive, consistent advocates for climate policy, and when they're not, we'll count that as a negative. And so we're running petition drives and campaigns on a small number of policies. The scorecard will cover many more, but we're still working out the details of that. There are other things like, the question of, does a company offer ESG screened investment options in its retirement plan? Those are things where I think a focused scorecard for companies on that, which I think As You Sow may be working on, would be helpful in driving change. And we're interested in working on that kind of thing and helping activate employees and students to ask companies and push companies to expand their 401k offerings. So remind me, the second question then was—
say maybe 30, 45 seconds on which industries are most receptive to scorecards. Does that prompt change?
I think so the companies that are likely to move the fastest are the ones who already are kind of values aligned with this broader idea of engaging in society, not just in their own narrow individual actions. And we've seen, and then the ones where their businesses are most at risk from the climate crisis. Outdoor sports has been, I think, at the forefront of climate action and climate advocacy. Some companies like Patagonia have been very vocal and active, and I think that comes from values. Some companies like Mars, the chocolate and pet food company, have also been increasingly vocal and have been very clear about this isn't just individual action, this is about policy. And their supply chain is threatened by climate. So there are companies where they see direct risk to their business from the negative impacts. There are companies that already, I think, are very values aligned, if you will. And then there are the companies that are somewhat aligned, but at the same time see risk. And then it's a question really of how big is the risk and how does that compare to the risk of staying on the sidelines and continuing to take a narrow view of their responsibility for climate and what that might mean in terms of hiring, in terms of investor pressure, and in terms of customers. If they stay on the sidelines and millennials decide and Gen Z people decide, I don't want to buy stuff from this company, well, then they may be losing a generation of people as consumers. And I would think that's a bad idea for many companies. So we see the workforce as a particularly direct way to get the attention of companies, but it's not the only lever for influence. So I don't think it's sector specific, except in some ways maybe, honestly, the fossil fuel companies, they have the most risk from some climate policies and action, because it might actually, if they cannot pivot their businesses fast enough, it's going to hurt their revenue. And so they're maybe going to be the slowest to move, though some have started to. You know, BP has moved some, and I think that's great. But I think other sectors, whether it's hospitality or tech or biotech or many others, I think that all those companies, if they need to hire people and they're competing for top talent in some fields, this is something that's going to matter to them.
Well, I think we have time for just one more question, unfortunately, and we have one from Steve Hams, who represents business climate leaders, who we mentioned earlier, and Citizens Climate Lobby. He says, great presentation, Bill. Question, have you developed a specific strategy to advocate for spending stimulus and recovery money, the billions that are coming down the pike, toward transitioning to a clean energy economy?
We are starting by trying to work with some other organizations to get agreement on a set of principles, rather than trying to put forward, here is our policy proposal, the money should be spent this way. Because our belief is that we can get a broad coalition aligned around a set of principles, that we need to decarbonize, we need to actually create jobs and protect jobs, we need to protect people's health, and a few others, that's the place to start. And then as the negotiations get going, there's going to be a lot of jockeying, but if we can have those principles that everyone can look back at and say, we've got broad support across a range of businesses and business associations, that will help us look at and help politicians and then individual companies look at a specific proposal and say, this is not aligned with the principles many of us agreed are important. So we're starting with the principles, not with a specific policy proposal. Those will come. And there's not going to be just one more, stimulus, bailout, recovery, whatever you want to call it, bill, right? There's one that I think we expect to get across the line this week, which I think is the fourth stimulus package. Mm-hmm. The expectation right now is there will be an infrastructure bill as the next major tranche. How big it'll be and exactly when it'll happen, I don't know. It might also get pushed out because they may decide they need to, actually kind of provide another backstop for the PPP or something else. So the timing of all this is really uncertain. And if I were betting, not that I like to gamble, I would bet that there's going to be another 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of stimulus and then recovery, maybe more. So it's important to have the principles that we can all agree on, not just the specific policy proposal.
Great. Well, great. Bill, if you could take just 20 seconds. We have a question I want to sneak in from Rich Yap. Are you thinking about, from someone else, I'm sorry, about unions? And are you factoring them into your strategy?
We have thought about unions. We've talked to a couple. We are not currently actively collaborating with unions, but I think they are an important avenue for, it's about influencing companies and it's about leverage, and especially for the people who are not in the professions that require advanced degrees and where there's been such intense competition, and especially as the labor market softens, then the way in which people in those kinds of jobs will have leverage is through unions. So yes, we are looking at ways to collaborate with unions and try to find approaches that will work for workers of all sorts and also drive the climate solutions we all need.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Bill. We're running at the end of the hour, and unfortunately, we do need to drop off. So thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, today. And as always, we hope you stay safe, sane, and sanitized, and we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you.